thanks for joining, especially in middle December. We appreciate your discipline in postponing your winter holidays so that you could get in more Zurich Cyber Risk Wednesdays. So this is the third in our series of Cyber Risk Wednesdays. It is the third Thursday of every month for an opportunity to get people together and talk about systemic cyber risk. The first event that we held was on systemic cyber risk generally, and the project that we are doing with Zurich Insurance to look at the systemic cyber risk, because we believe that too often we're looking at cyber risks the way that we looked at financial risks prior to 2008. That is one organization at a time, without looking how failures can cascade in ways that the experts would have told you earlier was absolutely impossible. And we are looking at cyber risks, one organization, and so this is a 6-month project to look more deeply at this and come up with recommendations. And I want to say thanks to Jeff Schmidt, one of our Zurich Cyber Risk Fellows, that's joining us here today. So the second in the Zurich Cyber Risk series was last month when we looked at cyber insurance. We had a panel that included Marsh and Zurich and others to look at the role that insurance can play in helping to look at the systemic cyber risk issues and dealt with cyber risk management. And today's panel is on electrical resilience and cyber threats and what we can do to make the future electrical system more safe and resilient to cyber threats. So I won't go in depth in the biographies because you already have those in your hands. As changed to what we originally advertised, we're planning on going for about 90 minutes. Each panelist will talk for about 5 minutes, and this will give us more time for Q&A and also gets us to the wine and the cheese half an hour earlier than originally advertised, so you're welcome. To help ensure that the panelists speak quickly, I had a lot of tuna fish for lunch. And they will get a lot of my attention if they are not moving on, and they will get the full force that you don't even want to imagine. So to start with, we are going to go to Jeanette Lash. She's here from DHS. So we are going to talk about some of the threats and opportunities. We are going to start with Tom, and then go to Neal, and then Gib. Again, their bios are in your packet, and we will finish with Jeanette. So we've heard a lot of threats. We've been seeing in the news that hackers can bring down the electrical system. We've read that perhaps they've even already done so in Brazil. And Tom, I know that you've been teaching this topic at Black Hat and studying it for a while, and perhaps you can kick us off on what you see as the threat.
Sure, definitely. Thanks, Jay. And so my perspective on the playing field of industrial control systems, and specifically as it relates to the electric grid, is playing simulated bad guy. Simulated only. We're all good guys, really honest. And so we see things from the standpoint of an attacker. We then get a chance to sit down with the electric utilities, whether they be involved in generation, transmission, distribution, both nuclear and non-nuclear, and really understand what are the systemic failures within those organizations, what aren't they doing well, what can't they be bothered doing at all in many cases, and disconnects that often exist between things like compliance and the realities of cybersecurity. So I want to step through just a couple of points I have here on what I see as being the biggest challenges to protecting what we call the bulk electric system in the industry, which generally refers to all of the critical components of what we generally refer to as the electric grid. The first big issue, I think, is there's a huge culture gap that exists. You know, we talk about a breakdown and the public-private partnership needing to be better and information sharing. A lot of these electric utilities don't share information well internally. Forget about working with the federal government or local government. They generally fail to operate well internally. if you've worked with industrial control systems engineers, the people that operate the SCADA devices, the people that build the systems that actually control the turbines of a generation unit at a power plant, they're probably 50 years old plus, right? There's not a lot of new blood getting into that industry. On the other hand, in the IT world, we have people that are coming straight out of college, very fresh blood, ideas about cybersecurity, but they don't really understand the industrial control systems world. And you get this game of finger pointing where your industrial control systems engineer says, hey, I've got this new box, it's great, it's for this smart grid thing, or it's for controlling this generator or this widget that whatever it does, and we're going to plug it in. You know, my internet service provider in my world is the enterprise IT group. So there's a switch sitting in my lab, so I'm just going to go and plug this thing in. And they get a call one day and they say, hey, this PLC that was controlling this 500 kV transformer has been hacked. And all of a sudden we've got people with lights out, and the first thing that the SCADA engineer is going to say is, well, it's IT's fault. They should have secured their enterprise environment more. And then the enterprise IT guy says, no, it's not. It's the SCADA guy's fault because he should have changed the default password. And a lot of the time we find that it's mundane problems like that are really causing the issues. And so we need to fix some of those challenges. I would hope that it's a generational issue, that we're going to slowly work through some of those things, but I think that definitely when we start talking about resolutions to some of these issues, trying to facilitate that conversation is definitely the way forward.
Do you see the technologies converging? And we'll come to Gib also on this. I mean, I know they're designed for if you're designing industrial, you want it to be reliable. If you're designing for internal IT, you're more worried about security. Are we seeing convergence between?
They're converging, and they're converging badly, because a lot of it is retrofit jobs, right? It's stuff that never was supposed to talk to an IP network that's being connected to the internet. And no one's really thought through what the implications of doing that are. But the business is saying, we need this information in the corporate cloud, and so they're just plugging everything together and hoping for the best. Absolutely. In the electric utility especially, there's this mentality of lights always being on, everything's okay. If you talk to energy executives, they'll tell you that as long as the lights are on, which means the electric meters are running, they're a happy camper. And I once had the CEO of one of the biggest electric utilities in the country tell me, if it's not $1 billion problem, I don't care about it. Which just quantifying cyber as $1 billion problem is not always easy. Compliance dodging. I've unfortunately been, as someone in the private sector, been a part of the problem as much as I have the solution. We've had electric utilities come to us and say, we've decided that in order to be compliant with NERC CIP, it's going to cost us X million dollars, versus if we break up our network so nothing is critical, that's going to cost us half of what it would otherwise cost us. So how do we do this securely? And so they've already made that decision, so we're definitely not pushing them down that direction, but there's a lot of that goes on. I'm sure you see that all over the place, and we really need to make sure that we're starting to stomp that out. And the final thing I want to speak to, which touches on the gloom and doom scenarios that we hear about on 60 Minutes and every other media outlet these days. It's really not that easy to take out the bulk electric system.
Why is that?
You may be able to take out one electric utility, a local distribution grid, maybe even some transmission lines. But the doomsday scenario that we try and project upon the grid is extremely complex to manifest. It's extremely heterogeneous. It's not like everyone's running Windows XP on everything. There's a lot of different vendors, a lot of different configurations. One of the funniest bulletins, I apologize in advance, DHS ICS cert put out a warning
Can
saying,
you say ICS, what you mean by DHS ICS?
Sorry, so DHS within the US cert, I believe it's part of US cert, right, still, has an industrial control systems advisory capacity, and they put out a warning right after, and I'm going to say the word that I promised I wouldn't say, Stuxnet, and basically
as long as no one says Snowden, then we're really fine.
warning U.S. consumers, electric utilities, that Stuxnet could basically be turned around against the U.S. bulk electric system. And the truth of the matter was that if you really understand what Stuxnet did, it was so surgically targeted against a very specific installation, a very specific industrial process, which in this case was nuclear enrichment, that to think that it could be targeting, electric distribution or transmission is just crazy. And certainly, there's been speculation abound much like that. So I think that's another thing we need to work very hard on, is having people understand the realities of the situation while not downplaying it.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're this is a point that we pick up a lot, and we talked a lot in our cyber conflict history, which just came out, A Fierce Domain, where we're always overemphasizing the likelihood and impact of disruptive cyber attacks. And one of the reasons that if you're doing a cyber attack, you're only taking down things that are made of ones and zeros, things made of silicon. And we tend to underestimate the ability of determined defenders to swarm around the problem. I mean, when you get geeks enraged to fix something, they can fix it very quickly. And so you're right. I mean, it's been out of the range of the stereotypical two kids in the basement to do this kind of thing. But I mean, theoretically, a government could really commit to hitting it and hitting again and having multiple different vectors, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Given the right amount of funding, the right amount of preparing for the event, one of the things we try and educate CEOs of electric utilities on is the lights may very well be on, but in DoD there's this concept of preparing the battlefield. There may be adversaries on your network that are waiting for that point in time in 5, 10, 20 years, because not every country has an administration with a maximum shelf life of 8 years and a philosophy longer than 8 years, that might be waiting for that opportune moment in 20 years to hit a switch, by which point they may have got access to enough of the grid to cause a significant impact. I
hadn't thought about that. If I can rephrase that and see if I'm getting it right, because a lot of the problems, if you wanted to say, good, let me get my cyber capability into this government department or this critical infrastructure, in normal IT, it might be there 18 months and then they upgrade the system and your capability isn't any good anymore. But because it's an embedded base that's there for decades, you're saying if you got into the electrical system, it's more likely, or frankly any industrial control system, that if you were able to get your software into the dam and the back door, then it's likely to be there. Yeah, especially if you have supply chain influence. I never actually thought. God forbid we get this equipment, these devices manufactured overseas. That would never happen, right? Because normally the half-life of a capability tends to be very, very short if you're targeting IT. Yep. But it would be longer. Absolutely. For industrial. That's really interesting. So, Neal, I'd like to come to you next. So you had a background in NCTC. You started writing about industrial control systems with your "Can You Trust Your Toaster" paper from the 1990s, and now with PwC, you're out talking with these companies. And we're going to come to Gib next, because Gib, I know you've been working heavily on these and smart grid and these other systems. So I'm interested in really getting your thoughts. But Neal,
sure. So, to clarify, NCTC is the National Counterterrorism Center. I was one of the first officers that reported for duty when they stood up in 2004-2005 timeframe. Now I'm a director at PricewaterhouseCoopers, where I spend all of my time doing forensic investigations of cyber attacks, cyber crime, economic espionage. If someone gets hacked and their system goes down, I'm there to do the investigation. So that a career in counterterrorism and a career in forensic investigation, plus this will date me, but I used to be able to code in Fortran and Pascal. So I have some familiarity with industrial control systems on the wrong end. That means that I come at this from a threat perspective. I come at this from how actual human beings have sought to exploit vulnerabilities, exploit trends, exploit capabilities to do damage, either on the government side or the commercial side. And I want to follow on some of the comments that were made, which is where I've seen the threat evolve, which the bringing down the grid and flatlining the grid is the stuff of a lot of stories and doom and mass hysteria pieces in news magazines, but that doesn't track with where I've seen the threat evolve up until very, very recently. nation states wanting to understand other states' power grids for potential attack in a conflict, yeah, that's always been a threat. It's not a cyber threat. It's not a new threat. It's a perennial threat. It's also a threat I don't think should be considered in isolation from generally what countries would do the United States harm. I don't think it's useful analytically or technically to divorce a country bringing down our power grid from a cyber perspective apart from the other geopolitical considerations of why they would want to bring down any part of our grid. I think those need to be considered together.
Can I follow up on that?
Sure.
Especially with Tom's point that this stuff is really difficult to take down and especially to keep down over time, which means it's not going to be just a couple hackers. It's going to be much more serious, and that probably means bureaucracy. That probably means country. Mm-hmm. And what we've seen, and this came out of the history, is that international relations matters. I mean, countries aren't attacking each other out of the blue. So you think this would happen as part of an existing crisis?
If it's a nation state doing it, there's going to be a geopolitical context. It's not going to be, whoa, the power went down and stayed down for a number of reasons. Now, in terms of the power going down and the grid going down, is that possible? Yes. Mother Nature tends to do that on a fairly regular basis. Anyone who lives around here when it really snows hard knows that the power goes down fairly regularly. I've been on planning staffs where the question was vis-a-vis a specific country, hey, can we bring their power down? Like, well, we can, but they manage that on their own on a fairly regular basis. Why would we do that? A tree grew too close to a power line in California in 1996 or 1997 and short-circuited quite a bit of the power grid on the West Coast. It happens. It wasn't an evil tree. It was just a tree in the wrong place at the wrong time. Keeping it down for a long time is what gains strategic or tactical or military advantage or effect. Keeping it down, I think Tom made the point, is the hard part. Targeting and accessing, yeah, you got to figure out how to do that, but sustaining the attack and keeping it down is a challenge. Can nation states do that? Again, I wouldn't consider that analytically or technologically outside the broader context of who can do us harm in the nation state. Terrorist groups have not materially gone there, in my experience. And this is something I've studied for a while and did some operations in that space for a while too. We haven't seen terrorist groups seriously thinking and seriously acquiring capabilities to bring down significant parts of the power grid other than bombing supply chains and whatever grid they can short circuit. Mm-hmm. Haven't seen them keeping it down, haven't seen them innovate. Now, that said, terrorist groups have traditionally used the internet for communications, logistics, coordination, enhancing their productivity. That's where we've seen terrorists traditionally operate. The problem with terrorists is they don't innovate until they do. Terrorists wouldn't do that until they do. Terrorists are notorious for not informing us about their strategic plans and shifts. So as terrorist groups are more comfortable using technology, just like as they got more comfortable using certain tactics and techniques and procedures, then they may have a generation which goes this way. What does concern me is some of the trends that create more vulnerabilities. So, yeah, you have the storms. What I'm worried about are the trends that would actually result in keeping it down. Threats are out there. It worries me how some threat actors can move up the spectrum of capability in terms of understanding systems and exploiting backdoors, as Tom mentioned. Supply chain integration, the Internet of Things, where we have more and a greater diversity of things linked up with the oncoming IPv6 concerning the smart grid. Will introduce brittleness possibly and the wrong type of resilience and we're not sure what vulnerabilities that will introduce. We have seen the acceptability of cyber attack as a tool of foreign policy with no evident pushback recently. So how will states start to go this way, not just in an actual conflict, but as a means of asserting their foreign policy prerogatives just short of military? The outsourcing of malware development and even botnets as a managed service. All this combines to a vulnerability trend. A set of trends that does concern me.
Do you think that nations can get themselves, 2013 has been an amazing year on the international side with US and China having presidential level discussions, US and Russia having presidential level discussions, the UN Group of Government Experts agreement that says international law applies. Do you think that countries might come to norms that getting into the power supply, the bulk power, the way Tom mentioned, might be considered off limits because it's escalatory? I've certainly heard that, and I think even Dick Clark came up with that as an idea that
So I mean, I wouldn't even hazard a prediction on where the development of norms will go. I agree with you that it's been a good year, even a couple years, with some of the other studies and manuals that have come out, and with recent, the emerging framework that'll come out sometime early next year. I mean, we're putting marks on the wall of what best practices are. We're putting marks on the wall of these are things you need to think about. That can only result in a good trend. That can only provide a good foundation for more and richer international discussions about what ought not to be done. Now, whether we cordon off certain parts of the grid or the web or the internet, or what's a target, what's a not target, what's a hospital in cyberspace, how do you put a red cross on top of something in cyberspace, I don't know if we can even get there technologically, and I don't know if our decision makers or any other decision makers would want to remove those options. And just from a planning perspective, once you start walling off parts of what is not acceptable to attack, are you sort of saying, and the rest is just go for it?
Right.
I don't think we're going to get ourselves in that position. Yeah. What I do think is useful is elevating this to the right discussion. Tom had a perfect example of the SCADA people point at the IT shop and the IT people point at the SCADA shop. Neither one should have the primary responsibility for managing this risk. It's a corporate issue, and it ought to be managed at the corporate level. You have to focus on something. We cannot simultaneously police up all the vulnerabilities. It's important to understand what is truly important to the enterprise. That's not a question the IT shop or the SCADA engineers can answer.
I am a little bit concerned because I thought we had agreed beforehand that we were going to go with the American pronunciation, SCADA, and now we're slipping down into this Britishness.
I was just trying to get a laugh.
And to explain a little bit about my question to Neal is electrical normally can be considered a legitimate dual-use target during wartime. I mean, it's common, if not ubiquitous, at least for the United States, to use that as a target. And it would certainly make sense to take it down using cyber rather than kinetic, because then you don't have to rebuild it like we did in Iraq or in other countries. You can just take it down for the period. I mean, theoretically, you can take it down for the period you need it down and then bring it back up. Talking between big powers, US, Russia, China, maybe India, Pakistan, and others, the concern is that because you normally for cyber operation, you have to be in place weeks, months, or even years beforehand so that you can figure out what's going on, you can see what normal operation is, you can see what the backup plans are, so you can figure out better how to break it. Because electrical power is what it is, that perhaps it's, some have said it's really escalatory to have people mucking around the system. The US certainly thought, or certainly seems to have thought it was when we, according to I think the Wall Street Journal, had found just that had happened within our own electrical transmission system. So such background on where we're going with that on the norms, and that countries might say, well, hold off. Okay, so.
Or even, and you can even get even further granular, like the one that, technically legitimate or not, nuclear power has its own set of policy issues that goes with it. And the cutting of a feed to a nuclear power, or, for the water control systems that go into a nuclear power plant, that can cause exponentially more damage than if you just short circuit a transformer farm outside of town.
Yeah, that's a really interesting example. And one of the early big worms, I think it was SQL Slammer, actually found it during the Northeast blackout of 2003. There was a discussion that maybe one of those causes was that not only was SQL Slammer happening at the same time and might have distracted IT staff and other staff at the electrical companies, but SQL Slammer was even found in one of the nuclear power plant's control systems that was supposed to be completely air-gapped. And it had somehow made the jump, probably because people had interconnected in the back. So there's some saying, oh my gosh, did this virus, this worm, somehow contribute to the power blackout? And I believe the answer was no on that. Gib, you've done a lot on this, and we've been talking a lot about the threat of like, oh my gosh, smart grid, we're doing this interconnecting, but there's a lot of promise to smart grid too. So I know in the comments that you had looked at, I was wondering if you can also maybe just cover a little bit of the promise and why smart grid is such a good idea.
Sure. I mean, the whole goal of smart grid, obviously, it's to help us improve the efficiency of the grid, to get more out of it. It also can potentially improve resiliency, which us security people like that, and we like the idea that there's more redundancies. You can route around problems. You can have other resources available because it is supposedly smarter. You don't have to send somebody a long ways away to do something. There are downsides to that, though, as well, because if you have an individual, you need somebody to go to actual plan in order to cause something to happen, then it makes it very difficult for somebody to launch a cyber attack that way. So that is the double-sided issue of smart grid with respect to security. If you do it right, you add resiliency, you add better visibility to problems, you can detect them more quickly because you have more instrumentation available all the way down to people's houses to know what they're using to detect problems. You can instrument security technology into that as well to look for anomalies, to be able to respond to them more quickly. You're introducing tools with more processing power that therefore can do a lot more things that can add to that. So a lot of the problems we've had with the grid, which is knowing where the problems are, because traditionally, historically, when utilities have had outages, they get a call put in, and somebody may put a post-it up on the board. Okay, this house is out. This house is out. Oh, it looks like we probably have a problem here.
Really?
And now most of them have gotten more sophisticated now in terms of how they do their systems. But a lot of that is there, and even with the San Bruno gas explosion in the Bay Area, there was a lot of having to figure out what was reported when and where in order to figure out where the source of the problem was, and so that's the sort of the thing where. You're going to add additional value to the conversation in order to be able to basically respond to events more quickly, to respond to them. So when you have problems on the lines, you can route around them. You can hopefully avoid what happened in Yuma, Arizona a couple of years ago, where a lineman was working on a line, and as a result of a mistake, the transmission line went out, and all the systems responded by assuming that something was at risk and at threat, so they basically closed things off. That caused a cascading effect that blocked out most of Southern California. Making a smarter grid helps you isolate those problems to a more contained region and quickly realize, and if you use better technology that allows people to share data about where the problem is, then they recognize, okay, I don't need to cut off because the problem is there, and you make it much more surgical. So those are all the positives.
Can I ask two other? I mean, one, and I've heard it's more green too, but I'm not quite sure. And if you can walk us through that, and any advantage to consumers, or is this mostly the advantage to the electrical companies themselves?
Well, I think that is one of the challenges as they've been rolling out. The federal government, as part of the stimulus, spent about a few $1 billion funding things like smart meters and other technology. Mm-hmm. And so naturally, a lot of utilities jumped on and said, we certainly will take money. That's great. But
so does the Atlanta Council, by the way.
But when they started doing the math, there's certain things like metering is probably the least way to reap financial rewards for both utilities and ultimately for customers. It does give them ability to do certain things if you set it up right, such as time of use billing, and be able to disconnect, and you get better instrumentation. But the way a lot of utilities are using it, just for better billing purposes, is usually not cost effective. And so that was a lot of the more visible signs of where the spending was. Where you really save money, which translates into consumers benefiting, is on some of the core, more hidden stuff in substations and behind plants and other things like that, where you can get better understanding of what's going on in the overall grid, and you really can concentrate your spending rather than having to put a meter on every house and things like that. So there is a lot of debate, and I think that's one of the reasons why a lot of the smart grid spending has sort of leveled off in the last year or two, because number one, the federal funding went away, and there was a little bit of disillusionment about what are the real benefits, and there's been pushback from public utility commissions about utilities showing the financial benefits that consumers will get. You have histories of consumers complaining, I'm paying for a plant that's not going to be built for another 10 years and things like that. Because utilities make money in very interesting ways, and it's that's one of the things that people need to recognize in terms of most regulated utilities. They have to pass their costs back onto the consumers. They get a guaranteed profit in many cases, and so depending upon how they can pass along those costs is going to have a lot to do with whether they move forward with an option. That's just the reality. You don't really have a choice because of the way that they're set up. So you have to look at it in that context of being able to tie it back to a particular benefit, and that's one of the challenges with security. Actually, is being able to tie it to a actual benefit and be able to build the rate case for it. So
and that's going to be state by state.
Yeah, state by state, and of course, it's going to vary also because most public utility commissions, in California, the Public Utility Commission essentially regulates 3 utilities, and then the rest is handled by municipalities, and then in theory the Department of Agriculture for co-ops, although there's depending upon how you view those regulations. There's a variety of different ways and different funding mechanisms and different approvals depending upon what kind of utility it is and what their goals are, and so.
So can you walk us through a little bit on the federal regulation before we take it, Jeanette, and hear about DHS? I mean, so some in the audience might have heard about NERC and FERC, and I mean, we assume feds are in this space. Mm-hmm. And I know Tom has some thoughts on this. I'll come to him in a bit. But so how does that work on the federal regulation?
Well, you have FERC is the energy regulator for the federal government. They are responsible largely for the transmission system, what's sometimes called the bulk electric system, mm-hmm. Which is their responsibility. They don't have responsibility generally for local utilities, mm-hmm. unless there's some tie-in based on a certain threshold and things like that. And therefore their authority gets transferred to NERC, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, which is an industry organization similar to organizations like FINRA and the financial services mm-hmm. market and others like that, that do get their cues from FERC about what guidance they are. But NERC as an organization, the members vote on what the regulation should be. Again, with FERC mm-hmm. influencing that and having some ability, and FERC is ultimately the one that would impose fines if there were issues. But NERC NERC is both U.S., Canadian, and parts of Mexico as well too. So it's not just a U.S. organization. So you have all that sort of thing. And for example, in Canada, the NERC regulations are enforced by province. So there's some differences there too in terms of the consistency of how you would impose fines and things like that, depending upon what jurisdiction you're in. But NERC is obviously as an industry organization, their members are utilities. They are certainly going to balance it, and they have to deal with FERC, but they also have to deal with the fact they have increased costs. They have to have a way to apply those costs and recover those costs. And so they're going to support regulations that make sense, but also don't impose too much of a burden on them. And there's a variety of ways that those burdens can be applied. And part of the challenge there is also what applies. Right now, some estimate about 20 to 25% of utilities have to comply with NERC CIP. The other 80%, and there's about 3,000 utilities in the U.S. About the other 80% don't have any NERC CIP obligations. Now, some of that's changing with the next version 5, which may bring on more, particularly the generation side. There may be more that have to do. There's running debates about what actually applies, and there's a high, medium, and low context for some of that. But that's the challenge. So local distribution utilities, probably under version 5, still won't have any NERC CIP mm-hmm. obligations. The argument, though, is that they cannot influence what's called the bulk electric system, that they are really the endpoints and receive electricity. But whether they are operating or not, the theory is that they cannot affect everyone else.
It's a local crisis, but not a national disaster.
Right, and there's been running debates and studies over the years about whether or not that is true. That whether somebody doing some action at the local level, if you suddenly drop all your load, which under a smart meter concept, you could actually push a button and turn off every house all at once under some implementations, and that could have an influence on the grid, if only for a period of time, because you are causing a major disruption, even to the point of affecting more than that local utility.
In the FERC, NERC, have they been getting involved in smart grid and Internet of Things going forward?
Most of smart grid, certainly the metering side is not part of NERC SIP.
Because it's not bulk.
There are parts with the synchrophasers and some of the other transmission.
Can you say that again?
Synchrophasers.
Oh, that sounds cool.
That basically just start measuring different things. Their instrumentation in the grid are really measurement-only capabilities, but are used to help inform multiple utilities about what's going on and give better situational awareness at a broader level. So those things are certainly falling into place under things like NERC SIP and others. But a lot of what we would consider to be smart grid technology, metering, a lot of the substation automation technology, distribution automation technology, even a lot of our distributed energy technology, we oftentimes lump wind and solar into smart grid type things. Eventually we might be able to plug our vehicles and supply power into the grid that way. So a lot of those things are currently not, wouldn't be under the scope of smart grid.
Is anyone in the government looking at those?
Certainly NIST has been looking at that. NIST has released, and I think they just had a new version, but the NIST Interagency Report 7628 is really targeted at securities for smart grid. So that covers everything. Their mandate wasn't under NERC or anything else like that. And in fact, the Department of Energy, when you submitted your proposal for a smart grid grant, you had to provide information how you would secure it. And the Department of Energy has gone around to these utilities and has actually asked them, in some cases, very pointed questions about how they're doing security for that. So, is it enough? Probably not, but it is certainly a start in terms of showing that they're addressing those things, and that not just that they did it at one point in time, but they actually have a plan for ongoing implementation of that.
There's certainly a lot to worry about because the model of, in general, as technology is release early, release often. Push the product out and then figure out how to get the security to do it afterwards, which is fine when it's something for your phone, but can be quite a bit different when it's bulk electrical transmission or metering to the house. I did want to take a pause before we go to Jeanette. We are live casting this right now, and we are taking questions over Twitter, and it is hashtag Cyber Wednesdays. And we will be taking questions, and we've got a diligent team of young geeks sitting in the back. Hey, geeks, that are going to be taking those questions. The geeks just waved back hi. So, Jeanette, we've heard lots of promise to the technology, some threats, but not as bad as we might have feared on threats, but certainly a huge, sounds like, gap in vulnerabilities and maybe even getting wider, if that's kind of a summary of how we got here. You're at DHS, you're task force that's implementing some of what the president asked for. Can you walk us through in where you're at in your work?
So just for some context, as many of you may remember, President Obama did talk about cybersecurity in his State of the Union, and this was a big deal.
Is he going to again?
Nobody knows. Very likely. So this is, of course, it has been a priority for government for years, but in recent years, this has just become even higher of a priority. So after the president talked about this in the State of the Union, signed 2 directives. One of those has gotten a lot of the press, which people have dubbed the Cyber EO. It's executive order for critical infrastructure cybersecurity. The second one is a little bit more under the radar. It's a presidential policy directive. For those of you who work in this space, a presidential policy directive is it's a more enduring, more strategic look at how the government is organizing itself to achieve a certain mission. And so this was a rewrite of critical infrastructure security and resilience. And so this is not just about cybersecurity, but it's just how the federal government organizes itself to address the mission of improving critical infrastructure security and resilience to include cybersecurity. So both of those were issued simultaneously, and there was a method and a reason behind issuing those simultaneously. part of it being a cultural, as some people have alluded to, is that there are a lot of people touching on pieces of the security of critical infrastructure, but they're coming at it from different areas. And so some of what we wanted to do was implement both of these directives together, and by standing up a task force and bringing both the physical security community together with the cybersecurity, and then further in the cybersecurity, the IT folks with the ICS folks, so that bringing all these folks together from both the government side, the federal government side, the state, local, tribal side, as well as the private sector, to work on a series of deliverables that the White House kindly gave us very little time to complete. So we've spent the last several months since February of this year working through that, and DHS doesn't have all the responsibility for executing the deliverables within those directives, but we have the majority of it. And we also have the responsibility of serving as our Secretary provides the strategic guidance for the federal government with regards to critical infrastructure, security, and resilience, and we also serve a convening function. So, and just to help people understand a little bit, I won't go too into the weeds of the bureaucracy or the acronyms, but the way that we've organized ourselves internal to the government, and this is for several years now, is this stood up as to deal with some of the terrorist issues and how the public sector can partner with the private sector. We've divided the world conveniently into 16 different sectors, and we have what are called sector-specific agencies that are the lead. So while DHS has this overall convening and strategic priority setting role, there's also agencies that, as a result of their expertise, are the lead agency for partnering and making progress in that sector. So as you can imagine, the Department of Energy would be the sector-specific agency for the energy sector, which includes oil and natural gas and electricity. And then throughout the government. And so what we have done over the past year is several things. One of them being looking at the public-private partnership. How is it working? Are we making progress on achieving defined objectives? Rewriting our national plan for critical infrastructure, security, and resilience. And then, as a part of the cyber executive order, we had several objectives that we were trying to achieve and that were borne out in many deliverables that we have a web page. I'm happy to direct people to the ones that are being made public. But the sort of the pillars are, one, the cybersecurity framework, which NIST has had the lead on, and many of you have probably been following this. They've been doing workshops around the country, and this is about coming up with that document that can get us a common lexicon for how we talk about cyber risk, and can provide a tool and a process for people that want to understand how they can best manage their cyber risk. So we had a lot of private sector, large businesses, small businesses, owners and operators of critical infrastructure, vendors. So a lot of, and then as well as the public comment period. So a lot of really great conversation about what's the best way to talk about how you manage your cyber risk, and what are those best practices that can be a part of that.
I have to say, I was a grump about it. I mean, I've seen too many initiatives that have come by in the last 15 years, and it was surprisingly good. Is the intent that the electrical companies, whether they're generating or distribution, would be using the framework that's in this new NIST manual, and would Department of Energy include that as part of their regulation?
Yeah, so, well, I'll get to regulation in a second. This is, so the executive branch cannot do anything that we don't have current authority for. So the executive order is what we currently have authority for, and it kind of pushes and aligns people, but there's not new regulations. The part of what I want to talk about, in particular, a lot of what we've worked with the electric sector on is how do we incentivize adoption of the framework. And so the framework itself is not, it's not a NIST standard, it's not a NIST handbook. It is a set of different tools and best practices that industry primarily has come together and said these are the things that work in these different functions of managing your cyber risk. How people use that then is, once a company or a utility or can adopt the framework independent of the government doing anything, and that would be great. We would love that. We, DHS, though, are also tasked with standing up a voluntary program to assist with the adoption of the cybersecurity framework. And part of what we're also looking at is incentives, both incentives that the government has available to us, both now in terms of technical assistance, all the programs that the government has available to help build capacity within critical infrastructure, but also things that would require legislation and other changes. And then the other is market drivers. How can we, you talked about insurance at your last one, so the insurance market is something that we're very interested in continuing to build that space. Rate recovery for price-regulated industries. Those, the federal government doesn't have a lot of, we have some regulation in that space, but working with the states to, and the different utilities commissioners and others to help understand how can utilities be building that case for prudent investments, and that the framework can be the tool to help them do that. So there's a lot of different pieces that we're looking at, particularly with the electric sector, but with other sectors that we would like to start pulling those different levers that we as a government have available, but also as a market we'd like to see some growth in. And so that's what we're exploring right now. We did publish some reports, but there's more to be done in that space. You had a question?
Two quick questions in there, because one, I had a little confused face when you talked about authorities, because I would think that if you say, I would assume the reason why we would want to do security for the electrical sector is so that it's more reliable and resilient, and I would think that it's not a big stretch from current authorities to say if security puts reliability of the grid at risk, then it's an easy extension. I'm not pushing to say we should go regulate, but I would think authorities wouldn't necessarily be the issue, at least for electrical or for finance sectors.
Well, as Gib was explaining in terms of regulatory authority is what I was referring to, that most the utilities being regulated at a state or municipal level, and that that we have the FERC, but so that's what I was referring to. And so there's a need to partner with the states and municipalities to understand, and some states have really been far ahead and very sophisticated in this, in helping their in their space understanding why cybersecurity is a prudent investment and should be considered as a part of the overall risk management planning. And so this is just going to be, it's sort of just accelerating that. Was what we're trying to do as a part of follow-on with the adoption of the framework. And so there's that piece. We're also, of course, continuing to look at information sharing. What information sharing has become sort of a big topic that has taken on a lot of different meanings to a lot of different people. So some of what we're trying to do is break down who are we trying to share information with, for what purpose, and what is that information that owner-operator needs or the government needs. A lot of what we're trying to do is change some cultural pieces, declassifying data faster, having more unclassified data, but also improving for those conversations that need to be classified. We have the ability to grant non-federal entities clearances. So working through that process, and I won't talk too much about the information sharing piece because that's not what we're here to talk about. But
well, can I ask I know for finance we had the ISAC, the Information Sharing and Analysis Center. I was vice chairman of that, and then we had the Sector Coordinating Committee that was more senior and to help provide governance to the sector and be our face to government.
Right.
Does electrical have that?
Yeah. So to get into the electric sector has actually done a lot of work in this space on both the physical and the cybersecurity side. And to your question about what the federal government is doing in particular, the Department of Energy has worked with the electric sector and DHS. They have a cybersecurity risk management plan. They are reworking that now. So they have built maturity models and to help people understand where they're at in their cyber risk management maturity. And so we're actually leveraging a lot of what the electric sector has done to help with other sectors who are a little less sophisticated and less aware of their cyber risk. Now that doesn't mean that it's been translated down to every single small rural utility. That's still something that we need to continue to work on. But we have partnerships with NERC, exercises. We just had a big exercise called GridX, where bringing executives together to walk through some of the and I keep talking about the cyber and the physical because we're constantly stressing that it's unlikely one is going to happen without the other. So bringing those communities together, having people understand their dependencies, both other sectors understanding their dependency on power so that they're planning, but also the electric sector understanding their increasing dependency on cyber systems. And that's sort of a lot of the analysis that we did in partnership with the private sector was to identify entities where a cyber incident could lead to catastrophic consequences. And so what was good to point to some of what other folks have said is that there is, the sky isn't falling. I think most people who are reasonable in this space don't think that's the case. But there is real vulnerability. There is real risk that needs to be understood. Understanding that catastrophic consequence is really important for the federal government. Luckily, it's not a large list of entities, but it's also important to understand that maybe those entities that don't have that potential for catastrophic consequence now, as they upgrade their systems over the next 5-10 years, getting into that, designing the security into their systems now and that resilience into both their physical and their cyber systems is all that more important now. And so those are some of the things that we've been doing. As a couple of folks have mentioned, the cyber framework is out in a preliminary form right now, so people can look at it. Comment period did close a couple days ago. There will be a version 1 of the framework published in February, and so we really believe that this is an enormous first step in sort of getting everything together, the common lexicon, the building the community to have these discussions at the same place and getting some agreement on some of our goals as a community, not as just the federal government, but as a community, and doing this in a voluntary nature. Now, I will say that one of our requirements and incentives that we're looking at is streamlining regulations. So there's a lot of people that face a lot of different regulations and look for ways to maybe not comply completely with those regulations. And that's not what we want to see. We want to see that, how can we do a better job of reducing audit burden and making it easy for people to do cybersecurity instead of making it a hindrance.
And one last insider question, because I thought of this when you talked about the convening function. And how often does the NSS and the White House get you up to convene and kind of check on how things are going? I mean, have they been pretty good at shepherding? Okay, good. All right, good. Yeah, I don't want to get you in trouble. All right, perfect. All right, so we've got other questions for the panel. In particular, I'm interested in hearing their ideas on recommendations and solutions on what next. But I know we can keep talking on this, so I think let's get a couple, see if we've got questions from the audience. Okay, and Ron Marks. And by the way, I do want to thank the members that are here, because I see some members and maybe some future members, and also board members and executive committee members that are here. So thanks for joining us.
I want to thank this member by the time I'm through.
And we'll see what you got here, Ron.
This is for all of you. You guys are great technicians, and what I've been listening to here is wonderful. But I just sat about 2 blocks from the White House with several CEOs whose name you'd recognize, and someone very senior in a lobbying organization here, all of whom are still confused because, well, they're old geezers like me, and they sit around and they scratch themselves, and they have young people like you come to them and say all kinds of things like you just said. So let me put it to you this way. If you're sitting across right now from the guy who's the head of Pacific Gas and Electric, or Pacific Power and Light, or Con Ed in New York, or wherever else, what are the 2 or 3 things that this guy has to worry about? Or let me rephrase it. Do right now that will protect his system or her system, as the case might be, from some kind of breakdown here. Yeah. And when you talk about that, think about cost as well, because the other issue that came up in that meeting today was those rules are all lovely, but how much are they going to cost me when it's all said and done? And
I'm gonna even add a touch to that question, if you don't mind, because I see Jeff Schmidt here and one of our cyber risk fellows for Zurich, and he says when he talks to CEOs, sometimes they'll bring up, all right, I get this is going to be a problem that's going to cost me, if it happens to go bad, this is going to cost me 2 weeks. And I'm going to lose 2 weeks of my life trying to handle this problem. But that's not catastrophic. I mean, if you were trying to focus on the catastrophic, that's why I like the analogy to the financial crisis, because we thought it would only give us one bad quarter for a few companies, and it gave all of us a few bad years. So I'd be really curious, what are those things that aren't just, they just know they can ride out and have, a couple tens of thousands of outages. Anyone want to pick that up?
So we've actually recognized that we haven't done the best job in educating the boardroom, as we like to say. And so we've had several meetings with CEOs of, we actually started with the electric sector, and talking, give them the classified threat briefing. Help them to understand that there is a real threat out there, and this is sort of what we see, and have the conversation with them. And I think that goes a long way to improving the partnership, but just helping them understand that it's not just sort of inside the beltway, everybody running around thinking, trying to make a future for ourselves. So,
I think they really want to know what
right, so that was,
supposed to do here.
Yeah.
Interesting. It's a lovely threat. But
right.
What am I supposed to do about it?
So we
what
have
are
that
we
exact
supposed to do about it?
conversation then is, okay, well, you've just told me this. What am I supposed to do? And I think part of it is we're learning from them is, well, what do you need in terms of, do you know who your CISO is? Do you know who your CIO is? Do you talk to them on a regular basis? Some of those kinds of things. But also, do you understand your dependencies on IT and ICS? Do you understand just at a basic level where your vulnerabilities are, and those dependencies both within those large companies but across? And I think that's where we start the conversation with them. And then sort of where does cyber risk stack up in all of your other risks that you're trying to manage? Recognize that they have a lot of risks that they're trying to manage, and help them understand, we can give you this information, but at the end they have to make the decision of, well, I have some trade-offs that I have to make. But that's sort of what we're saying right now, and I know others are having the
And I like,
same.
because that fits in a lot with what we've been doing for our work with Zurich Insurance, and that's for the boards to understand their risk exposure, because I've seen a lot of surveys, including some that the Brits just put out, Her Majesty's government, that show that boards have a fair amount of confidence that they're understanding the risks. But then, how much do you understand like IT operations, or how much do you understand how much you've outsourced? The boards are a much lower level, and so it's. Right.
Yeah.
And it's difficult, but it's difficult to understand your risk if you're not understanding IT operations and you're not understanding what you've outsourced. I mean, to me, that's an interesting gap. So, understanding the risk exposure is certainly big, and that's free. That just takes time. But from what Tom was telling the risk exposure is changing. So. Okay, let's go, Tom.
One other thing I want to quickly add to that is I think we as operators need to understand that someone like that, you're not going to change their value system by giving them a classified briefing on threats. They may think that it's very impressive and good job, you collected some useful information on the Syrian Electronic Army, but they're not going to go back to their reports and say, okay, we're changing everything we're doing tomorrow, right? Right. We, in the West, we don't do nuance very well, right? We have to see bodies in the street, unfortunately, before we get shocked and horrified and start thinking about things. Predictive thinking doesn't really get us very far, and so I think you have to really articulate the issues in ways in which the executives understand. Which you may occasionally find a CEO that has that is an IT enthusiast, and they may have but that's not going to be the norm. You need to cater your message to the masses, which are, stock price, are the lights on.
And we were talking about digital Pearl Harbor for 20 of the 70 years since the actual Pearl Harbor, since 1991. So probably, just scaring, we need to do more.
Well, I was going to say, some of that analogy is like telling somebody, car accidents kill 200,000 people a year or whatever. Yeah, okay, that's a problem. Are we to stop driving cars? No. And so, we can't give them the answer what they want. What they want is, you buy this firewall, you put it there, and you'll be fine. Or you ban all USB devices, or you do a lot of, it's all of us do this. Any area that we're not an expert in, we assume the answer is very simple and whatever. Oh, what do you mean, doctor? I have to exercise for all this time? You can't just give me a pill and I'll be fine? We all do this, whatever. And so, getting from a framework to something that they can walk up to their Public Utility Commission and say, we're going to spend $5 million next year on cybersecurity. And here's why that's the best investment we can do with that money. And a lot of them are looking up and says, okay, DHS, okay, whoever, tell me why buying this many Cisco firewalls or buying this many things among all the options that I have to do in cybersecurity is the best way to do it. Now, obviously, the answer is, here's the framework. Now call one of us, and we'll go and tell you to buy those firewalls or whatever. But they still get to that point where, okay, give me something I can give to this Public Utility Commission who's going to be accountable to the public that says you're going to raise my rate another 10 cents, or whatever, well, probably not that much a kilowatt hour, but a significant amount for this thing that, is that really the best option for that amount of money? And I think that's the part that everyone struggles with right now.
And mine isn't, part of my advice, I think that's really good, is that we don't have a history of these things and how they interact. I mean, we know that we rush things out and then we tend to secure them afterwards. So it's interesting. I don't necessarily even think that, on my hand, hey, here are 3 things that you have to buy or 3 companies that you should, bring in them for consulting or the rest is boy, we're rushing into this new technologies that we're the things that we are most dependent on, ensuring the lights are on. And we don't know how they operate very well singularly, and we certainly don't have any experience with how they operate on a group. And so I think there's a lot of caution to be had there. And I also think we might even consider talking more to shareholders. I mean, I've almost given, I don't want to say I've given up on boards, but you can only talk to so many boards. But talking to CalPERS, talking to Children's Fund, talking to if you could get BlackRock, if you could get Warren Buffett to come up and say, I would only buy in a company that has good cybersecurity or I'm going to have to fix it. I mean, something that's going to get a corporate board to say, hey, my shareholders are demanding this. And you can't go shareholder by shareholder, but it's one of those things that might scale.
Yeah, I do want to say that I think that there's a lot of CEOs, though, that maybe don't get enough credit that are interested in this and have looked into it and have. Yeah, so I don't want it to, sort of not, they need to get the credit for the fact that there are a lot of people out there who are considering cyber as a part of their enterprise risk management in the electric sector as well as others. And so I think that we need to keep working on what's the right message. It needs to be tailored. Not everybody's the same. We need to understand the drivers for both the small as well as the large, and they're very different. So and a lot of it isn't about government. A lot of it is about business to business, conversations, consumer demand, those sorts of things that we're not always the one that is, out there sort of in the front seat, but we'd like to nudge a little bit.
I want to play on something that she said. I mean, my advice to the corporate suite of the board is to own this issue. That this is a boardroom issue, this is a corporate suite issue, this is not an IT department issue. Now, what does exactly that mean? That means there's at least 2 functions that the corporate suite traditionally plays and the board traditionally plays, including communicating with shareholders, which I think is an important thing to do, putting this in the enterprise risk management system. And there's also a role for, there are other questions you can ask the government. There are a lot of benefits the government can apply. The corporate suite, go to the DHS, go to law enforcement and say, what are the questions I should be asking my IT department, my HR department, my counsel, my line managers? What are the questions, what are the things I should be pinging them on so I can do a better job of calculating cyber risk as part of the enterprise risk management? How can I work with my internal audit committee and my external auditors to provide better transparency for our shareholders into the presence of cyber risk aggregating within our board, just like my auditors are supposed to be doing for the investing public with other types of risk management? The corporate suite can also use their prioritization function. They can go to these threat briefings and say, okay, yeah, Syrian Electronic, are these all these bad guys? Who is trying to do what to my digital assets, right, and how are they likely to do that? Then you go to the CIO, then you go to the CISO, and maybe reconsider whether the CISO reports to the CIO, but then you say, what are you doing to prioritize investments around these things that I was just told are possibly going to happen to us, more likely than any other Martian attack that you can conceive on the threat side. You go to your business line managers and you ask them a question that they probably already know. What are the value drivers? What are the 20% of the business operations, however you characterize it, that make up 80% of our profits? Then you go to them and the CIO and say, what are the digital assets that directly support the value drivers? And how are we prioritizing protecting what is truly important to our company? How does that rack and stack against threats that are putting resources into damaging our stuff? Are we putting resources to mirror that? Those are all questions that are appropriately asked at the corporate suite. And there are questions that, working with the government, I think the government would be happy to tell you, here are some good questions to ask your legal department, your HR department, your training and awareness department. So that's what I would say when I say to own this at the corporate level. And then finally, if you want to get a little bit more technical, ask the defense people, ask the IT department or whoever controls information security and protection, are you putting all of your investments behind keeping the attacker out, or are you trying to shrink the amount of time that we actually detect there's somebody in our systems? Because those are two different things.
Okay, sir, and then I'll go to Jeff. Right there.
James Sang, we've been largely talking about threat-originated risks, what you could call, I guess, exogenous risks. But as one has increasingly integrated and complex systems, of course, one has endogenous risks. One could say that 2008 was an example of endogenous risk and no real threat. How happy are we with our R&D efforts to be able to identify endogenous risks as we go down the line to smart grids and stuff like that? I mean, NIST, I guess, is supposed to do this. FERC's supposed to do that. Is that really enough?
Yeah, I'm going to Gib, on the, we've been talking about, external actors doing attacks, but I mean, as we're making it so complex and interconnecting these things and having them connected to the internet, and that seems like it introduces all sorts of its own vulnerabilities that, there's so much complexity there that's just tinder, and it seems like the spark could come from anywhere, not just external external
Yeah, I mean,
attackers.
Either, obviously the outages have proven most of the, if not all of the outages in the United States and certainly around the world have proven that it's usually likely to happen through sort of accident or misconfiguration or something else like that than through some sentient actor that wants to do harm. And smart grid is absolutely the poster child for one of those challenges, which is additional complexity to the system. If you cannot, this is the difference in transmission distribution today, you could pretty much run that without computer. It's going to be hard and it would be painful and you would need your staff fully deployed in a lot of substations to do it. You could do it. You can't generally run a generation plant that way. And in the future, you may not be able to run any electrical grid without computers, without a lot of advanced technology that's all working synchronously together to be able to understand what's actually going to do, because it adjusts based on what other parts of the network are doing, and you need to know that information in order to adjust. So for example, you may be able to reduce the amount of generation that you send if consumers on the other end are saying, I'm getting 125 volts and I only need 115 or 110. Well, you need all that accurate information to know where that is happening. Otherwise, if the information is wrong, you can get brownouts, you can get other problems. So you're depending upon all this information working together. In the past, it was very dumb, and so yes, you didn't know a lot of knowledge about that, which is what, and was less efficient. But it worked because you weren't changing every millisecond to adjust for what actually could happen in there. So, but there's positives to that, which is you get better understanding of what the problem is and be able to react similar. But if you do it wrong, a simple misconfiguration of, say, DNS or routing tables or something else like that's innocent could turn into a significant problem, as we've seen in other around there.
Yeah, and when things are loosely linked, and then you have more space if one thing fails, that it's not going to cascade. But we're making it ever more tightly linked, and this is, I think, is a real concern that the internet was never supposed to be tightly linked to anything. It was just security researchers, right? I mean, just university researchers, and also you tend to get cascading failures when you've got common mode failures, where you're depending on one thing to do many things. And really, the internet is the ultimate common mode failure. I mean, we're starting to rely on everything. And so I'm really curious that if you've got these internet failures, how that is going to play in these different components that might be more difficult to connect to.
Well, that's the trouble with cascading failures. We talk about cascading failures on the grid. They're very difficult to predict, right? Like August 2003.
Even before we connected it to the internet.
Right, exactly. Take out the technology systems, it's still difficult to predict. I think that's why, I mean, comes down to the very essence of risk management, right? This is why we need things like product certifications. We need rubber stamps on industrial control systems to say that they've had these 5 checks. They've been resilient against these 5 different security threats. And there are some bodies like ISA with ISA Secure that are developing those standards, those technical standards, so that we know if we deploy this device into this particular environment, our risk, this 20% kind of unknown risk is going to be related to human error or some, crazy 0 day that a nation state has spent millions of dollars developing. We can deploy that device with a certain level of confidence, which is puts us in a lot better spot than we're currently in. And I think, unfortunately, certification, unless the federal government starts telling people how we should actually specify and build control systems networks and smart grids, which they're not doing, and I don't think they'll ever do, it's very difficult for the federal government to then come up with standards which those environments can be accredited to, which give us high levels of confidence. So I think at the end of the day, it's going to come down onto the consumers and the private companies to make sure that the products they're buying have these rubber stamps and that they're developing their networks in a certain way.
Yeah, rubber stamps make them sound like a paper tiger, but I mean the stamp of approval. Yeah,
right.
Okay, good. I'm going to go to Jeff, and then we're going to take some questions on Twitter. Jeff here, cool breeze with sunglasses on his head.
Hey, thanks. So when I think about whether something should be in my, this is a really big problem bucket, or in my, this is an inconvenience bucket, a lot of times I look at the response scenarios. As Jay mentioned earlier, and as we've talked about quite a bit, IT systems historically have been relatively easy to take down, but relatively hard to keep down. And in fact, we see, the bigger the problem, the more smart nerds that swarm around the issue. When historically we've had really big problems, we've had really big swarms of really smart nerds, and the bigger the problem, the smarter the nerds, and the things get solved. I look at the electric grid, and I actually see potentially the inverse. So in the electric grid, the response model historically has been based around regional acts of God or regional oopses. And the swarming model tends to work by, everybody send all your trucks to Florida because there was a hurricane. That response model works great to get Florida back online quickly, but breaks down when the whole country is having a problem at the same time, or large parts of the country are having a problem at the same time. The response model seems to actually work in an inverse way. It becomes less efficient the bigger the problem. So I'd invite comments on that.
Interesting. And theoretically, we might be, if we're all relying now on the same underlying digital technologies to interconnect things, there's a case there that we're more likely to be seeing not just local events, but more national events.
Right. I mean, the threat model changed. So, by definition, Mother Nature works on a region, and oopses tend to be regional. But now that the threat has changed with, larger scale thingies, be those thingies the internet or smart grid or a common software vendor or hardware vendor or whatever, the potential footprint of an impact grows from a tree falling over a distribution line.
Nerd Swarm sounds like a 99-cent app that no one buys.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think one of the, and that's the challenge. We know, again, to set bucket traps. I mean, you don't need to train your linemen anymore to fix a line in a neighboring utility in most cases. There's some variation in some of the equipment, but most of the things that you need that labor for, you can have a person in the lead and the others can follow. When you get to a lot of the computer systems that are being run, particularly industrial control systems, if you varied, say, Emerson or Honeywell or Vensis or some of the other ones, it's not only unique by the vendors, but it's unique by the implementation. There's some vendors that pride themselves on developing a custom system just for that utility. And and then of course the vendor then reaps 10, 20 years support contracts as a result of that as well, because nobody else can support it. But beyond that, there is this notion that everything was basically designed for this particular utility. And so if you did have that's why GridX and other things are interesting in terms of what people would do in those situations. You're not going to just send, other utilities, send all your nerds over to this utility and we'll fix the problem. Yes, there are folks like on this panel and other places and SCADASEC and all the other groups that can contribute some bits and pieces of it, but it really is not the same thing as a bunch of lines coming down and you send bucket trucks over to get it. And so we need to understand, and that's not just with the electricity, but with other sectors as well. How do you actually get mutual assistance in a cyber room? Number one, when it's a cyber attack,
or generally surge.
Yeah, nobody wants to talk about it, for one, because they feel, you get hit over the head, nobody feels embarrassed to say, I got hit over the head, please help me. When it's a cyber attack, everybody feels like, it must be my fault, blame the victim. And they don't want to put out the word to say, send some help. And then there is a challenge of just having the right amount of expertise in that period of time to be able to solve the problem.
I'm hopeful that once we get past a certain threshold that Jeanette's been talking about, that companies are going to be more willing to share information because it's obvious that there's something national going on, where Americans are pretty good about pulling together, and Canadians too, assumedly.
I think with it varies, depending on the industry. I think, the electric sector is very good at sharing information. We have, folks that sit on our watch floor, our 24/7 operations for, cybersecurity, responding to incidents and events, and, both on the, US CERT, which is the IT side, and our ICS CERT. So I think that you have to take each sector as they are and figure out what are those drivers to share that information. I think the electric sector is pretty good at it, and we have a really good partnership with them. I also think to some of what your point too is what the threat. There's a lot of people working on the threat, and what we're really interested in is better understanding consequences and better understanding. When I talked about the work we're doing on understanding what could lead to catastrophic consequences, we actually didn't look at a specific threat. We didn't look at whether it was an external threat or an internal threat. We didn't even look at whether it was malicious or not. We just assumed that there's a cyber incident. Could that lead to these series of events that would be a catastrophic consequence? And this area of consequence, I think, is really important to understand from the cyber, particularly when you're going from a cyber event crossing into the physical space, and then sort of understanding what a cyber response looks like. We've spent a lot of time with FEMA trying to rationalize this notion of what our national response framework is, and how do we do that in preparedness and planning and response. And we're incorporating cyber into that, but it's such a young space, and the role of government versus the role of a state or local versus the role of the private sector is very undefined. So what we need to get to the point where we have that doctrine written down so people understand who's doing what. But it is evolving, and so we're in the stage right now where we're taking the lessons from the financial sector, from other incidents where we're partnering and working at what does that national response for a cyber incident look like, and what are those thresholds to where you get to a federal intervention. And so that's something that's going to take a few years to.
That was going to be one of my questions when it was on FEMA. I've got one.
I just wanted to quickly add that I think the issue that you allude to of the trucks all swarming in Florida is significantly, exponentially compounded in the cyber domain. All of those folks from different electric utilities swarm to Florida. They all know what a transformer looks like. They know this cable connects to this cable, connects to the generator. They kind of know how it all works because it's a much more simple system. In the cyber domain, to your point, some of the biggest electric utilities in the country that I've worked with do not have two generation plants that look anything like one another. They are completely different. And if you have someone from another electric utility show up and say, I'm Bob from Northern Electric Company here to help someone from Florida Power, they probably don't have other people within that electric utility that know the problem, let alone someone from another electric utility. So you're going to end up today, we're heavily reliant on non-standard systems, and the only people that really know how to fix those systems are probably the people that work locally to that plant, or maybe even people that retired 10 years ago that originally installed the thing.
So heterogeneity has some advantages, but some real drawbacks in this. That's interesting. And I have one clarification question for Jeanette. So I know there's a private sector seat for the financial services ISAC on the NCIC floor with someone that had clearance. Do you know? Did the electrical sector have
Similar, yes.
Okay, great. That's great to hear. Okay, we are going to go to Twitter next, and then I saw one here, and then I saw one over here.
Thanks. I got 2 questions from Twitter, remotely related, and then 2 more we can come to later. First, does securing the U.S. electrical system have more to do with infrastructure reform than cybersecurity? And with that, doomsday scenarios are hard to do in cyber tactically, but what about strategic loss of kinetic dependencies, #domino effect?
Okay, can you say the first one again?
Does securing the U.S. electrical system have more to do with infrastructure reform than cybersecurity?
Infrastructure reform rather than cybersecurity. So if we want to make sure that, for example, a smart grid is going to be safe, secure, at least as safe, secure, reliable as what we had, that's less to do with password security and making sure that, our normal kind of CIA stuff that makes our little CIA SSP hearts beat faster, versus just doing having new, fresh infrastructure that is.
Yeah,
I'm not sure that its infrastructure will solve the cyber problem. It certainly would help, but part of it is also what infrastructure you're talking about. I mean, are you talking about replacing transformers more frequently? You're talking about a lot of other things. Certainly those all have issues because, as we found out with the Northeast blackout, again, SQL Slammer was supposedly a side effect of that, but we had a number of different problems happening, and aging infrastructure does make small problems larger. And so there's no doubt that improving that infrastructure so that when a surge in a line happens, you don't end up blowing out a transformer because it was at the end of its life. The average age of a transformer is supposed to be 40 years. The average age in the U.S. of actual transformers in existence is 43 years old. So there are problems with the infrastructure. I'm not sure that, that's a matter of issue about making things worse. I don't think that necessarily solves the cyber problem.
Yeah. Anything?
I think the infrastructure, refresh, if you will, issue is a long-term fix. My personal view on kind of security certifications is, how about we certify the people installing the bad equipment and configuring things with a password of root before we certify the security professionals that probably already know what they're talking about. So I think that long term, at Fed Cyber, actually, I had on a panel with Rich Marshall, we were going back and forth on the idea of, is it possible to develop a perfect information system? And I don't think it is, right? Regardless of how well we design this little widget that's going to go into an electric grid, it's never going to be perfect. So at some point, we've got to have infrastructure that is inherently going to protect in the event that there is some imperfection there. Yeah. But that's, to your point, you're looking at 40, 50 years plus life cycle, time on something we install today. It's going to take a long, long time. So we need a shorter term solution than that.
And the other question prompted me to think, EMP? We haven't talked about EMP. And I know there's a lot of people in this town that are like screaming, saying, oh my gosh, we haven't talked about EMP yet.
That's one of those things. That's
electromagnetic pulse, right?
Yeah, electromagnetic pulse, which is commonly associated with an electromagnetic discharge from a thermonuclear detonation, which, okay, if we have thermonuclear detonations going off, we've got EMP problems. We've got some other problems too.
Yeah, that was always my, if terrorists got a nuke, they're not going to.
So what you're talking about is a non-nuke, yeah, right, exactly. They're not going to short out a transformer. They're going to do something else.
They're going to nuke us. Yeah.
So I think the relevant debate there is non-nuclear EMP, and there's always fabled demonstrations in the desert, usually associated with various hacker conferences, of, hey, look, I use this non-nuclear EMP to flatline a car. It completely dead-celled the battery and all this other stuff. Just the sheer recreational hacking community, if those things were widespread and wholesale available, I think we would have seen a lot more demonstrations of EMP. For generating the types of effects that we're talking about, I think EMP is possibly, fable or not, one of a number of tools that still runs up against the basic technical challenge that Tom and the rest have talked about, that there's a difference between bringing down a grid and keeping down a grid. The type of EMP that would fry the circuit boards of enough systems to really keep any sort of appreciable grid down. Technologically, I don't know how you get there short of a nuclear EMP. And then, as I said, we're talking about other issues, and cyber kind of drops down the list a bit.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, no, for the lady.
You were
Go
saying
ahead.
something, I think. So.
Yeah, well, actually, I had a different question, but just to respond to that, I'm Deborah Decker at the Stimson Center. I supported DHS as part of their OECD Future Global Shocks project.
Oh, I love that stuff. Those are great.
Yeah, and so EMP, of course, came up, and it was solar weather that was causing it. And the big issue was that we don't have enough transformers, and that it's so expensive to just, one utility is not going to keep like, oh, let me keep a couple extra of these big transformers around. And generally, they're not even made in the United States. So, I mean, there's a lot of issues there. But that wasn't my question. I'm a member of the Community Emergency Response Team in DC. I went through training, and I've got, I can direct traffic, tag body bags. I even have my hard hat and my wrench to shut off gas mains, which I never knew I could do. But is there, and then a couple of weeks ago, I was asked to speak at a Dun & Bradstreet hackathon, where it was the first one they did, where they opened up all of their 2 billion data sets to the public. It was very quickly put together. The room was packed with 100 people at Microsoft, and all these volunteers came in, these potential hackers, to do socially useful applications. And my role was to tell them, "Ooh, what could you develop that might be socially useful?" They came up in that one weekend with some amazing things that D&B had said, you know what, we've been working for a long time on this. So in looking at potentials of how we could solve the surge question that you brought up here, is there a way to start a community emergency response team where I can sign up for, I'm maybe retired from the neighborhood power plant, and I can work with my son or somebody who's, I can be the functional requirements specialist, give him the technical requirements, and he can help solve this problem. So just throw that idea out.
Yeah, Jeanette?
Yeah, actually,
since you're nodding, that's
because
voluntary.
this is something that I really, I think there's a lot of potential in that area talked about FEMA before, areas that we're exploring it in just regular response, as you've seen, or you've talked about, but sort of this the notion of challenging a community of people to, we've done like apathons and things like that. Just get them all in a room and say, you get a patch from DHS or something. I don't know. Like, it doesn't take much to get these folks together, and they can, create a lot of really cool stuff. The other notion around challenges of sort of saying that, prize money or some other thing to solve some tough problems that the government is trying to deal with. And so we've had some success in that area too. And but then also this notion of getting, community, how are we mobilizing the community potentially? Because we do have this workforce challenge, particularly in the cybersecurity space. But yeah, so those are all areas that we're exploring, and I think they're really exciting and have a lot of potential.
And I want to throw out 2 more. I mean, first, I've been interested in seeing what the ISACs and sector coordinating communities have brought a lot of people together, but also in the regional stuff that DHS has done, as well as FBI for InfraGard. And InfraGard has been trying to get together for a while. Here's a group of experts that know something about grain silos, and here's different experts that know about electrical grids and the rest, and so that way the government can tap into these people, and they've been doing it. Frankly, former InfraGard president is now Deputy Undersecretary at DHS in charge, so I would expect to see more on that. Second, on the challenges, and this wasn't the core part of your question, but I got to throw it in, is we run our own, because Professor Eric Novotny is here from American University that's helping us with our Cyber 912 Student Challenge, because a lot of the competitions and challenges that have been happening were hack, counter-hack. They were, can you break into the system and defend your own? And that's great. We absolutely need those so that we can develop the technical skills, but we also realized we weren't growing people that understood the policy. So last year we had something like 20 teams from 17 different schools, had $5,000 in prize money. The whole thing cost us less than $25,000 for people giving national security policy advice as if they were on the National Security Council staff, to say things like, well, we would go to NATO and say we're not at Article 5 yet, but we might, but we think Article 4 is a good idea. Here's where we are on the UN, the UN Charter and how illegal this is or not, and therefore we think the president has these diplomatic, economic, and perhaps military options. So I'm going to, was there one question over here? I wasn't sure if there's a question. I'm in an expansive mood. I think the audience is still with us, and they're going to hold on just a little bit longer to wait for wine and cheese. And one more Twitter question, Jason? Jason Thielen, the Associate Director of the Statecraft Initiative.
Thanks, Jay. So this is coming in from Paul Toomey, one of our board directors, former president of ICANN. He's discussing that many energy companies, foreign energy companies, are part of or supported by the state, and they're supporting security organs. The question is, what about the vulnerabilities for U.S. interests abroad, and how does the electrical grids of other countries from an international perspective affect what we do?
I've got a little bit on that. Anyone?
I mean, other than what we said is that they're other than North America, we have Canada, U.S., and parts of Mexico that are on a particular grid, and obviously different countries have their own grid, depending on their own island country or part of continental Europe. They have other things, and so depending upon the others, we've heard certainly in the natural gas stuff, we've had lots of effects of Russia deciding whether they want to give somebody natural gas at any given point in time. So there's certainly effects there. Hopefully, there's been some discussions in terms of military bases, more so in the U.S. in terms of being able to support their functioning in the case of a disaster. I think that most military operations overseas, I think in the back of their mind are probably fully aware that they may need to have their own generation capabilities and others, and there's new technology for solar and other things, so they can be in the middle of Afghanistan and be able to bring things up quickly. And the more they can, and actually from a life-saving perspective, the less diesel fuel they have to bring there, the safer their troops are. So the better you can have renewable and other energy sources locally through whatever mechanism you can make up. But I think the military is certainly well aware that any time, or any government entity is well aware when you're overseas, you are at the mercy of their grid. For
and DoD gets that. I mean, I know the Pentagon has been very concerned about this. If power goes out here, they know they've got generators and they've got other things. They've got the Defense Production Act. They've got all sorts of levers that they can pull to get themselves back up, and they don't have those levers for the bases in Japan, or in Okinawa, specifically if we were getting ready for North Korea or China scenario. So I do know, Paul, they are taking quite a strong look at that, and I don't know where it is, but it had been quite a high priority. Okay, so I've got some final ones. Oh, and by the way, if you are interested in general energy things, we have a strong energy and environment program here. I don't know the dates on this, but I'm pretty sure Thursday morning we're going to have I believe it's the Deputy Undersecretary of Mexico that was involved in opening up Pemex and the Mexican oil industry. Will be here. He's the one that was personally responsible for some of this legislation that's just gone through, and he will be here talking. I think that starts at something like 8:30, so if you're interested, check online at atlanticcouncil.org. And you had brought up Ukraine and the latest natural gas issues that the Russians were giving a cut rate deal, and Senator McCain just got back from the Ukraine, and he will be here speaking, I think this week. I don't know, looking, Thursday also? oh, just hang out here all day Thursday. Why would you be anywhere else tomorrow when you've got a lineup like that? So any final comments, and then I'll close. Things you didn't get to say?
It's for lunch tomorrow.
Oh, I don't know. We'll have to check. But I'll tell you, tonight we've got some wine and some cheese for you, I'm pretty sure, out there. Because this is a really important part of what we wanted to get done, was to help create a community of people that were interested in these issues. And it's all too often that you start having a conversation, you have an idea when you're talking to someone at an event, and then you don't see them again, you lose the idea, you're not able to pick it up. So we want to help create that sense of community, of letting people know that you're going to come here every third Wednesday, and you're going to be able to see a lot of the same people and pick up ideas and hopefully let us carry this on through. So first I wanted to thank our sponsor, Zurich Insurance. This is part of the global aggregation of cyber risk projects that they have sponsored from the global CEO on down. To make sure that Zurich understands how these risk interdependencies that fit in with Sam's question, and make sure they understand this. The next in the series is January 15th, if that's the third Wednesday. And I'm really excited about that one also, because we wanted to get into looking at measurement and metrics. Because we think that is absolutely crucial. How can we talk about risk and managing the risk if we're not understanding how we're measuring it? So penciled in, we're pretty sure they're going to be able to make. We've got Kevin Sullivan from Microsoft. Fantastic stuff. Yes, he is confirmed. He's the one that's been looking at, all right, Microsoft has looked at all this data from how many computers there are clean in different countries. You know, when you say, please clean my computer, Microsoft, they keep stats on all that. And they took that data and they compared it against to a country's GDP and have they signed the Budapest Convention and where they fit on Transparency International Index and where that fits into Failed State Index to actually do this social science correlation. It's fascinating, fascinating work. We also have Yurie Ito of JP Cert and Asia Pacific Cert, who's been working with OECD on the OECD statistics effort, which is going to come out next year. We hope to have someone from Verizon, the data breach intrusion report that puts the statistics together for that. So we really think we're going to have a fantastic event. I'm trying to convince Dan Gear to come down because I think that would be a wonderful way to kick it off. And so before I let you loose, you'll notice that we've been drinking from our, we are the Cyber Statecraft Initiative. And we have been drinking from our Cyber Statesman mugs, because you can't have Statecraft without people that are thinking in that way. And so I'm going to present to each of our 4 people their own mug, because you cannot have Statecraft without people like this that are thinking big pictures. So I'll be giving these to them. I will give, since you are the person that hasn't been here before, Jeanette, you get the symbolic. Thank you very much. All right. Thanks to all the panelists. Thanks for all the great questions. Thank you, Zurich. And please, let's enjoy ourselves with some refreshments out in the hallway. Thanks again.